In the summer of 1976, the southern half of Basse-Terre began to empty. Roads filled with people leaving towns beneath La Soufrière, an active volcano rising above Guadeloupe's rainforest. Around 70,000 people were moved away from the danger zone. The problem was that nobody could say with certainty what the mountain was about to do. Scientists saw earthquakes, explosions, ash, and steam. They agreed the volcano was restless. They did not agree on what would come next. That argument would become one of the most famous volcanic crises of the 20th century. But the mountain is only part of the story. Guadeloupe looks compact on a map. In reality, it is an archipelago where almost everything changes over short distances. The rock underfoot, the rainfall, the food, the coastline, even the way history is remembered. And to understand why tens of thousands once fled this mountain, we first have to understand the islands it helped create. Guadeloupe's two main islands form the shape people often compare to a butterfly. To the west is Basse-Terre, steep, green and volcanic. To the east is Grande Terre, lower, drier, and built largely from limestone. Between them runs the narrow Rivière Salée, crossed today by busy roads that make the two islands feel almost joined. Farther out are Marie Galante, La Désirade, and the Île des Saintes. Together they form a French territory in the Caribbean. Guadeloupe is both an overseas department and an overseas region of France. French law and institutions are part of everyday life. Yet the climate, the language heard in homes and markets, and the historical memory of the islands are unmistakably Caribbean. About 383,000 people live in Guadeloupe today. Most live around the two main islands, where geography still decides where roads can go. Grande Terre opens into fields and the exposed Atlantic coast. Basse-Terre rises sharply into the forest. That difference begins with the ground itself. And once you cross from one side to the other, it becomes difficult to think of Guadeloupe as a single tropical landscape. The easiest place to feel those layers at once is around Pointe-à-Pitre. This is not the administrative capital, but it is the commercial pulse of the archipelago. Ferries arrive and leave. Cars funnel through the surrounding urban area. The harbor keeps the smaller islands connected to the main population center. For centuries, ports like this connected Guadeloupe to a much larger Atlantic system. Colonial products moved outward, while enslaved Africans were forcibly brought into plantation economies built for European profit. Today, on the Pointe-à-Pitre waterfront, the Memorial Acti confronts that history directly. The Caribbean postcard can hide how completely slavery reshaped these islands. But Pointe-à-Pitre does not feel trapped inside that history. Heading west, the urban density begins to thin. The road climbs. The limestone world of Grande-Terre is behind us. Ahead is the island built by volcanoes. Basse-Terre changes with altitude. Near the coast, the air can feel hot and heavy. Higher up, clouds gather across the mountains, and rain can arrive with little warning. It slips over black rock, falls through ravines, and feeds rivers that descend toward the sea. Above it all stands La Soufrière. At 1,467 meters, or about 4,813 feet, it is the highest point in the Lesser Antilles. The summit is not a perfectly conical volcano. It is a weathered, fractured dome where gases still escape through vents and fumaroles. The smell of sulfur is a reminder that this landscape is still active. Guadeloupe National Park protects much of the surrounding tropical forest. The water eventually reaches one of the archipelago's most important marine environments, the Grand Cul-de-Sac Marine. Offshore, a barrier reef extends for roughly 29 kilometers. Forest, river, mangrove, and reef belong to the same system. Geography connects them, and geography also shaped the people who came to live here. People lived in these islands long before Europeans arrived. Archaeological sites across Guadeloupe preserve evidence of indigenous communities that moved through and settled the Lesser Antilles over many centuries. Then, European colonization transformed the islands. French settlement expanded during the 17th century. The French Revolution brought the first abolition of slavery in 1794. That freedom did not last. In 1802, French forces moved to reassert colonial control in Guadeloupe. Resistance formed around officers and soldiers who understood what the return of the old order would mean. One of the best remembered was Louis Delgray. After fighting around Basse-Terre, Delgray and hundreds of others withdrew toward Matouba, on the slopes below La Soufrière. There, surrounded and facing defeat, they chose not to surrender. On May 28, 1802, the refugee was blown up. Delgray and many of those with him died. Weeks later, slavery was restored in Guadeloupe. It would remain until the final French abolition in 1848. The memory of that resistance still sits inside Guadeloupean identity, but history here is not carried only by monuments. It is also carried through sound. Guoka brings together ka drums, singing in Guadeloupean Creole, dance, and improvisation. It is performed at celebrations and cultural gatherings, and it has also accompanied social and political expression. UNESCO added Guoka to its representative list of intangible cultural heritage in 2014. Listen long enough, and the past here stops feeling like something locked behind museum glass. It is still being performed, debated, and reshaped by people living on the islands now. There is another side to island life that a beach photograph cannot show. Distance has a price. In 2022, consumer prices in Guadeloupe were about 16% higher overall than in metropolitan France. For food, the gap was about 42%. That statistic turns geography into something personal: a grocery bill, imported goods, and the choices families make every week. Guadeloupe's population has been declining for years. Younger residents often leave for study or work, while the remaining population is aging. By the beginning of 2026, roughly 1 person in 3 was age 60 or above. So the airport is not only a gateway for visitors. For many families, it means departures, returns, relatives in mainland France, and children deciding whether their future lies on the islands or elsewhere. Still, daily life remains intensely local. Markets are crowded in the morning. Fishing boats come in along small harbors. Families gather beside rivers on Basse-Terre or along beaches on Grande-Terre. Food carries African, European, Indian, and Caribbean influences without needing to announce where one ends and another begins. Calling that mixture cultural fusion is easy. Living inside it is more complicated. Guadeloupe is French, but it is not metropolitan France. It is Caribbean, but it is not politically independent. And the smaller islands make those layers even easier to see. South of Basse-Terre, the ferry to Terre de Haut cuts across open water toward the Île des Saintes. The forested mass of Basse-Terre falls behind. Ahead, the hills become drier and more exposed. Terre de Haut feels smaller in every direction. Roads narrow, boats dominate the harbor. From the heights near Fort Napoleon, the sea seems to surround almost everything. In 1782, during the American War of Independence, French and British fleets fought the Battle of the Saintes in this region. The clash ended in a major British victory, a reminder that these islands have never been as isolated as they look. sail northeast, and another landscape appears. Marie-Galante is broad, low, and agricultural. Sugarcane still covers much of its cultivated land. Old windmills and the remains of sugar estates sit among fields and grazing land. Here, the beauty of the countryside cannot be separated from the plantation system that shaped it. Places such as Habitation Murat preserve structures from the sugar economy, including a windmill and the remains of the cane processing works. Today, cane is still cut, transported, and distilled. The crop survived the system that once made it powerful. Then, back on Grande Terre, the road runs east until there is almost nowhere left to go. At Pointe des Châteaux, land narrows into a rocky Atlantic headland. On clear days, other islands sit on the horizon. From here, Guadeloupe stops feeling like a destination and starts feeling like part of an island chain. And that view makes the final part of the story easier to understand. Because in an archipelago formed by moving plates, volcanoes, and limestone, the ground is never simply background scenery. In 1976, it began sending warnings no one could safely ignore. By 1976, La Soufrière had become increasingly restless. Earthquakes multiplied. Steam-driven explosions threw ash and debris from the summit area. The volcano's hydrothermal system was under pressure. The danger was real. So was the uncertainty. Some scientists feared the activity could lead to a magmatic eruption. Others argued that the evidence did not show magma rising toward the surface in the way a major eruption would require. For the people living below the mountain, the distinction was not academic. If officials evacuated and nothing catastrophic happened, tens of thousands of people would lose months of normal life. If they did not evacuate, and the volcano erupted violently, the consequences could be far worse. The explosions were driven by hot water, steam, and pressure inside the volcanic system rather than a major new release of magma at the surface. Looking backward, that can make the evacuation appear unnecessary. But hindsight is exactly what the people making the decision lacked. They had an active volcano, incomplete information, conflicting scientific interpretations, and communities directly below it. That is why the story was more than a false alarm. It became a lesson in what happens when public safety depends on science that cannot yet give a clean answer. Today, La Soufrière is continuously monitored. The mountain still releases gas. Earthquakes still matter. Scientists still watch for changes. And the people below it live with something that is easy to forget when looking at photographs of waterfalls and rainforest. The same geology that gives Basse-Terre its height, rain, rivers, and forest is also the reason the island can never treat the ground beneath it as permanent. Guadeloupe is often reduced to a shape on a map. A butterfly floating in blue water. But that shape hides the forces that made it. One side rose through volcanism. The other is dominated by limestone. Rainforest drains toward mangroves and reefs. Sugar fields carry the memory of plantation slavery. Creole and Guoka carry histories that survived far beyond the systems that tried to control them. And above Basse-Terre, La Soufrière is still active. Not as a metaphor, as a physical fact. That may be the clearest way to understand these islands. Guadeloupe is not interesting simply because it contains contrasts. It is interesting because those contrasts are connected. The volcano, the rain, the roads, the ports, the plantations, the music, migration, and even the price of everyday life all lead back to the same question. What does it mean to build a society on small islands shaped by forces much larger than themselves?